The message came at 2:14 in the afternoon. I read it twice before I understood it. Don't contact us again. No explanation, no argument, no warning, just that. I did not reply, I did not call, I did not ask why, because something in the wording felt rehearsed, like it had been decided long before I received it. I set my phone down and went back to work. 2 days later, there were 58 missed calls. Same number, same people, different tone. I let it ring. Because by then, I already knew something they didn't realize yet. Whatever they had done to cut me off had not stayed hidden. I have always preferred things that do not change. Not because I am afraid of change, but because consistency leaves less room for misunderstanding. When people behave the same way every day, you do not have to guess what they mean. You learn the rhythm, and after a while, you stop expecting anything outside of it. My life followed a structure that rarely shifted. I woke up at the same time each morning. I left for work without rushing. I returned home without detours. Even my meals were predictable, not out of habit, but because routine made everything quieter. There was no one waiting for me when I got home. That was not unusual. My family and I were not the kind who stayed closely connected. We spoke, but not often. We met, but not regularly. There were no long conversations, no emotional exchanges that lingered. What we had was something more restrained, functional. My mother usually called once every week or two. The calls were short. She would ask if I was fine. I would say yes. She would mention something about the house or a relative or something that had already happened days earlier. I listened. I did not interrupt. There were always pauses in those conversations. Not uncomfortable ones, just empty spaces where something more could have been said but never was. I learned early not to fill those spaces. If something was important, she would say it. If she did not say it, then it was not meant for me to know. That understanding made things easier. There were decisions made in the family that I only learned about after they were already settled. Plans arranged, agreements reached, responsibilities assigned. Most of it happened without my involvement. It was never presented as exclusion. It was simply how things were done, and I did not question it. Not because I agreed with it, but because questioning it had never changed anything before. Over time, I became someone they did not need to consult. If something required support, they would inform me. Not ask, inform. The expectation was quiet but clear. I was supposed to be available when needed, even if I had not been included in the process that created that need. I accepted that role without resistance. It was easier to cooperate than to argue. I noticed things, though. Small details that most people would ignore. The way conversations shifted when I entered a room. The way certain topics were introduced only after I had already heard about them from someone else. The way my mother's tone would change slightly depending on what she wanted to communicate and what she wanted to avoid. None of it was obvious enough to confront, but it was consistent. Consistency creates patterns, and patterns, if you watch them long enough, start to explain themselves. Still, there was trust. Not the kind built on closeness, but the kind built on predictability. I trusted that my mother would call eventually. I trusted that if something serious happened, I would be told, maybe late, but told. I trusted that whatever distance existed between us was not intentional, just inherited. We were not distant because we disliked each other. We were distant because that was how things had always been. When I visited, the atmosphere was the same. Nothing dramatic. Nothing expressive. We sat in the same rooms, spoke about the same categories of things, health, work, relatives. Conversations stayed on the surface, never moving deeper unless absolutely necessary. I did not try to change that. There is a point where effort begins to feel misplaced, not rejected, but unnecessary, so I adapted. I became quiet in the ways they expected me to be quiet. I listened more than I spoke. I responded without adding anything extra. I allowed conversations to end when they naturally faded without trying to extend them. Over time, that version of me became the one they recognized. Reliable, uncomplicated, present but not intrusive. It created a balance. They did not involve me too much, and I did not ask to be involved more than they offered. It worked, at least on the surface. Because underneath that balance, there was something else, something subtle, a difference in how information moved. They always seemed to know more than they said, and I always seemed to know less than I should. It was not enough to create conflict, but it was enough to notice. And once you notice something like that, it does not go away. It just waits, quietly, for the moment when the pattern stops looking like coincidence and starts looking like intention. The changes did not begin all at once. If they had, I might have noticed sooner. Instead, they arrived in small adjustments, subtle enough to ignore but consistent enough to remain. At first, it was the timing of calls. My mother had never been precise about when she would call, but there had always been a rhythm to it. A pattern I could recognize without thinking. That pattern began to shift. Calls came at irregular hours, sometimes earlier than usual, sometimes late as if they had been delayed, and they were shorter. Not noticeably at first, just slightly reduced. A question asked, an answer given, and then a pause that did not lead anywhere. "I'll call you later," she would say, but she did not. I did not remind her. If someone says they will call and they do not, it usually means something else took priority. I understood that. I did not need an explanation. Still, I noticed it happening more than once. Then there were the conversations themselves. They became more controlled. Before, there had been small, unnecessary details, things that did not matter but made the conversation feel complete. Mentions of who visited, what was discussed, how something was decided. Those details began to disappear. Information became selective. If I asked a question, I received an answer, but only the part of the answer that addressed exactly what I asked. Nothing more. It felt measured, as if every response had been reduced to its minimum. I started to hear about things from other people. Not directly, indirectly. A relative mentioning something casually, a detail that should not have been new to me. "You already know," they would say. I would nod. I did not correct them. There is a difference between not knowing something and choosing not to acknowledge that you do not know it. I chose the second, because the alternative would require asking why I had not been told, and I already knew what the answer would be. It wasn't important. That was always the answer, or something close to it. Important things were defined by them, not by me. I began to notice gaps, moments where information should have been shared but was not, decisions that appeared complete without any visible discussion. It was not the decisions themselves that stood out. It was the absence of process. Things were happening somewhere I was not present, not physically, structurally. There were conversations I was not part of, and that by itself was not unusual. What was unusual was how consistent it became. Every time something new came up, I was slightly behind it, not completely unaware, just delayed, as if I was being updated after the fact rather than included before it. I tested it once. Not directly. I asked a question about something I had already heard from someone else. A simple question. The answer I received did not match what I had been told, not completely, just enough to feel incomplete. I did not correct her. I did not mention the difference. I simply listened. And I stored it, because inconsistencies are easier to understand when you do not interrupt them. They reveal more when they are allowed to continue. After that, I stopped asking certain questions, not because I lost interest, but because I wanted to see what would be offered without prompting. Very little was. The calls became quieter, not silent, just reduced. Even the tone changed slightly. There was a distance in it that had not been there before, not emotional distance, something more deliberate. as if the conversation was being managed, guided away from certain areas, closed before it could reach others. Once there was a pause longer than usual. I thought she might say something more. She did not. Instead, she said, "Everything is fine here." It was not a response to anything I had asked. It was a statement, unprompted. I remember that clearly, because reassurance, when it is not requested, usually serves a different purpose. I said, "Okay," and that was the end of it. But it stayed with me, not the words themselves, the timing, the way it was inserted into the conversation without context, like something placed there intentionally. After that, I began to listen more carefully, not just to what was said, but to what was avoided. There were topics that no longer came up, names that were not mentioned, situations that seemed to exist but were never described. I did not confront any of it. There was no clear reason to, nothing concrete, only patterns. And patterns on their own are not enough to accuse, but they are enough to prepare. So I adjusted, quietly. I paid attention to timing, to phrasing, to what repeated and what did not. And slowly, without saying anything to anyone, I started to understand that whatever was happening was not accidental. It was controlled, just not in a way that was obvious enough to challenge. Yet, the first time it stopped feeling subtle was over something small, small enough that it should not have mattered. Which is why it did. It was about a document, not an important one, at least not on its own, something administrative, routine. The kind of thing that moves quietly through systems without requiring attention unless something goes wrong. I heard about it from someone else, not directly, just a passing mention framed as if I was already aware. "You signed it already, right?" I paused for a moment. Then I said, "Yes." The conversation moved on, but I knew I had not signed anything. I did not ask for details. Instead, I waited. That evening, I checked my email, then my messages, then the physical mail that had been sitting unopened for 2 days. Nothing, no document, no request, no reference. I left it there. The next day, I brought it up casually during a call. "What was that form about?" There was a brief pause, not long, but long enough to register. "It's nothing," my mother said, "just something that needed to be handled." "Was I supposed to sign it?" Another pause. "No." "It's already done." The answer was clear, but not complete. I did not ask anything else. Because the moment you ask a second question, people become more careful with their answers. Instead, I let the conversation continue, and I listened. Over the next few days, I heard the same topic mentioned again. Different wording. Same subject. Each time, the details shifted slightly. Not enough to be obvious, but enough to create friction between versions. Dates did not align. The sequence of events changed depending on who was speaking. One person implied it had been urgent. Another spoke about it as if it had been planned weeks in advance. I did not correct anyone. I did not point out the differences. I allowed each version to exist on its own, because contradictions are more useful when they are uninterrupted. A few days later, I checked something I had not needed to check before. A record. It was not difficult to access. Just something I had never had a reason to look at. Until now, the document was there, completed, processed, finalized. My name was included, but I had not been contacted. Not by phone, not by message, not by any method that would have allowed me to be involved. I looked at the timestamp. Then I looked at the date I had first heard about it. They did not match. The process had been completed before it was ever mentioned to me. I closed the file, and I sat there for a while, not reacting. Just adjusting, because this was no longer about a feeling. It was a fact. Something had been done with my name attached to it without my knowledge. That changes the structure of things, quietly, permanently. After that, I started paying attention differently, not just to conversations, to sequences, who spoke first, who confirmed, who avoided. Patterns began to sharpen. It was no longer just about what was missing. It was about what was being replaced. Explanations that seemed designed to close a subject quickly. responses that answered questions before they were fully asked. I noticed how often my mother spoke in conclusions. It's already handled. It's not an issue. There's nothing to worry about. Statements that ended conversations before they could develop. Control does not always look like restriction. Sometimes it looks like resolution. Too early. Too clean. I tested something again. Not directly. I asked about timing. When did that get done? The answer came quickly. Recently. But I already knew that was not true. I had seen the record. I did not challenge it. I simply said, okay. And I let the silence sit. Because silence, when it follows something inaccurate, has weight. It does not accuse, but it does not agree either. The conversation moved on, but something had shifted, not outwardly, internally. The idea that I was simply being informed late no longer fit. This was not delay. It was removal, selective, intentional, and coordinated. That last part took longer to accept, because one person acting alone can be explained. Miscommunication, oversight, mistake, but multiple people repeating the same pattern that requires alignment. Not perfect alignment, just enough to maintain consistency on the surface. And that was exactly what I was seeing. Consistency, carefully maintained, just not deep enough to withstand scrutiny. I did not confront anyone. There was no advantage in doing that. Not yet, because once you confront something, it changes. People adjust. They become more precise, more guarded, and whatever is incomplete becomes harder to access. So I did the opposite. I became quieter, more agreeable, less present in conversations. I allowed them to assume that nothing had changed, that I had not noticed, that I was still operating within the same understanding as before. It made things easier for them and for me. Because the more comfortable they felt, the less careful they became. And the less careful they became, the more the pattern revealed itself. Not all at once, but enough. Enough to understand that what I was looking at was not confusion. It was design, and I was not outside of it by accident. I did not change how I spoke to them. That was important. If I had become distant or confrontational, it would have signaled something. It would have made them more careful, more aware. Whatever structure they were maintaining depended on a certain version of me still existing. So I kept that version intact. I answered calls. I listened. I responded in the same measured way I always had. But I started asking questions that required more than simple answers. Not direct accusations, just clarity. The first time I did it, the shift was immediate. It was a small question about timing, nothing complicated, just something that required aligning two pieces of information. The response came quickly, too quickly. "You're thinking too much about it," my mother said. Her tone was calm, not defensive, not irritated, just dismissive, as if the question itself was unnecessary. I did not respond right away. I let a few seconds pass. Then I said, "I was just asking." Another pause, then, "There's nothing to worry about." The conversation moved on, but something had changed. The pattern I had been observing quietly was now being managed more actively. Not through explanation, through reduction. Questions were no longer answered. They were neutralized. Over the next few days, I asked similar questions, each one simple, each one focused on details that should have been easy to confirm. And each time the response followed the same structure. Minimize the concern. Redirect the conversation. End the topic. If I asked about a discrepancy, I was told it was not important. If I asked about timing, I was told I was remembering it incorrectly. If I asked for clarification, I was told there was nothing to clarify. It was consistent, carefully consistent. At one point, I mentioned something specific, something I had verified myself. The response came with a slight change in tone. "That's not what happened." It was not said with uncertainty. It was stated as fact. I knew it was not accurate. I had seen the record. But I did not say that. I simply replied, "Okay." Because the moment you present evidence too early, it becomes something they can prepare for. Instead, I let the statement stand, unchallenged, and I listened to what came after. The explanation that followed did not match the statement. It shifted, adjusted, trying to close the gap without acknowledging it existed. That was when it became clear this was not just dismissal. It was active correction of me, of my perception, of my memory, not aggressively, not obviously, but persistently. The goal was not to argue. The goal was to make the question itself feel unnecessary, or incorrect, or misplaced. I started noticing how often language was used to reposition me. You're overthinking. You always do this. You don't understand the full situation. Each phrase placed me slightly further from the center of the conversation, not excluded, but discredited, quietly, and always in a way that sounded reasonable on the surface. There was no accusation in their tone. No hostility, just certainty. And certainty, when repeated often enough, begins to replace doubt, not in them. In the person listening, I understood that, which is why I did not push back, because pushing back would turn it into a disagreement. And disagreements can be resolved. What I was observing was something else. A structure that depended on agreement, or at least the appearance of it. So I gave them that. Outwardly, I agreed. I accepted explanations. I allowed conversations to end without resolution. And in doing that, I stayed inside the system long enough to see how it worked. There were moments when the dismissal became more direct. Not harsh, but firmer. Once, when I asked about a decision that had clearly involved multiple people, my mother said, "You don't need to be involved in everything." The sentence was simple, but it carried something underneath it. Finality. Not a suggestion, a boundary. I did not respond. Because there are statements that are not meant to be discussed, only accepted. That was one of them. After that, I noticed something else. Conversations started happening without me entirely. Not just decisions, discussions. I would hear about them later in fragments. References to things that had already been talked through, conclusions that had already been reached. And when I asked about them, the answers were always the same. It was nothing important. Or, we didn't think it concerned you. Concern. That word came up more than once, as if relevance was being assigned somewhere else, determined without me. I did not argue that either, because relevance in a system like that is not negotiated, it is decided, and I had already been placed outside of it. What mattered was not being included. What mattered was understanding why I was not. And that answer was becoming clearer, not through what they told me, but through what they avoided. The more I asked, the less specific the answers became. The more I listened, the more consistent the pattern revealed itself, until eventually there was no need to ask anymore, because the response was predictable. And predictability in this case meant something else entirely. The outcome had already been decided. I was just being guided toward accepting it, quietly, without resistance. And when the message finally came, "Don't contact us again," it did not feel sudden. It felt like the natural conclusion of everything that had already been happening. Not a reaction, a decision, one that had been building long before it was sent. I did not respond to the message, not immediately, not later. There are moments where silence is not avoidance but evaluation. This was one of them. If the message had come without everything that preceded it, I might have questioned it. I might have asked what caused it or whether it had been sent in anger. But nothing about it felt impulsive. It was too clean, too final, so I treated it that way. I put my phone down and continued with the rest of my day as if nothing had happened. Not because it did not matter, but because reacting too quickly would have served no purpose. By then, I already had enough to begin looking in the right places. That evening, I opened the same records I had checked before, not to confirm what I already knew, to expand it. Information, when reviewed once, gives you a conclusion. When reviewed again, it gives you structure. I started with the document I had found earlier. I read it more carefully this time. Not just the content, the sequence, who initiated it, who processed it, who finalized it. There were names attached, not just my mother S, others, some expected, some not. That was the first indication that the situation extended beyond a single decision. It had been coordinated, not formally, but consistently. I checked the timestamps again. Then I cross-referenced them with something else, communication logs. Nothing invasive, just enough to align dates and activity. Patterns began to appear. Moments where there had been increased communication between certain people, followed shortly by completed actions. The sequence was clear. Discussion, agreement, execution, all without me. I leaned back and closed my laptop for a moment. Not because I was overwhelmed, because I needed to separate observation from interpretation. The facts were straightforward. Something had been arranged. My name had been included. My involvement had been excluded. That combination does not happen accidentally. I opened the file again. This time I focused on authorization. Who had the authority to move something like this forward? The answer was not complicated, but it required assumption, or representation, which meant one of two things had happened. Either someone had acted on my behalf, or someone had presented the situation in a way that made my involvement unnecessary. Neither option aligned with what I had been told, which by that point was expected. The next piece came from somewhere I did not anticipate, a conversation that was not meant to provide information, just a casual interaction. Someone mentioned the situation in passing, not as a secret, as if it were already understood. "You were okay with it, right?" I looked at them for a moment. Then I said, "That depends on what you mean." They hesitated, not because they realized something was wrong, because they were trying to recall what they had been told. "That everything was already discussed," they said. I nodded slightly. "I see." That was enough. I did not ask anything else, because the statement had already given me what I needed. There had been a narrative, a version of events that included my agreement, even though no such agreement had been given. That kind of detail does not appear on its own. It is introduced, repeated, accepted, and eventually treated as fact. I left the conversation there, but it stayed with me because it confirmed something important. This was not just omission, it was substitution. A version of me had been presented in my absence, one that agreed, one that did not question, one that allowed things to move forward without resistance. In other words, the same version of me they had always relied on. The difference was that this time it had been used without my awareness. I went back to the records one more time, not to find anything new, but to confirm consistency. And it was consistent, every part of it, the timing, the sequence, the outcome. There were no gaps left to interpret, only the realization of what it meant. I closed everything and sat in silence, not thinking, not reacting, just acknowledging. Because once something becomes clear, there is no urgency left, only understanding. And understanding, in this case, carried weight, not emotional weight, structural. This was not a misunderstanding that could be corrected with a conversation. It was a completed process, with consequences already in place. And now, with the message, "Don't contact us again," it had been sealed, not as a reaction to me, but as a way to prevent anything from being revisited. That part was clear. What was less clear, at least at first, was why. Why finalize something like that? And then cut off contact immediately after. That question stayed with me longer than the others, because it suggested something beyond control, something closer to exposure, not complete, not public, but possible. And that possibility changes behavior. Even before anything happens, I looked at my phone again. No new messages, no missed calls, just the last one, still there, unanswered. I left it that way, because by then the situation was no longer about what they had done. It was about what they expected next. And for the first time, I did not follow that expectation. I did not respond. I did not reach out. I did not give them anything to adjust to. And in that silence, something shifted, not visibly, not immediately, but enough. Enough that 2 days later, the phone started ringing again and again and again, 58 times, from the same number that told me not to call. The first call came the next morning. I saw it, but I did not answer. There was no hesitation in that decision. Not because I was trying to make a point, but because I already understood the pattern well enough to know what answering would do. It would reset everything. The message, "Don't contact us again," would become temporary, conditional, something that could be softened or explained, and whatever had been set in motion would continue as if nothing had been interrupted. So I let it ring. It stopped after a few seconds. No voicemail. A few minutes later, it rang again. Same number. I was at my desk working. I did not reach for the phone. I did not silence it. I let the sound exist until it ended on its own. That was the second call. By midday, there were 7. By the evening, 12, all from the same number. No messages, no explanation, just repetition. I placed the phone face down and continued with what I was doing, not ignoring it, allowing it. There is a difference. Ignoring something suggests you are trying not to think about it. Allowing it means you are aware of it, but you have decided it does not require action. The next day, the pattern intensified. The calls came closer together, less space between them, as if time itself had become more urgent. I checked the call log once, not to count, to confirm, same number, every time, no variation. That told me something important. This was not outreach, it was focus. Whatever had changed on their side was not being distributed across multiple options. It was being directed at one point. Me. By the afternoon, there were more than 30 calls I still had not answered, not because I was trying to escalate the situation, but because I needed to see how far it would go without interruption. Because pressure, when uninterrupted, reveals its source and its limits. That evening, a message appeared, not from my mother, from someone else in the family. "Call back, it's important." I read it once. Then I put the phone down again. If it was important, it would have been said in the message. Importance does not require instruction. It explains itself. This did not. The calls continued. By the end of the second day, the number had reached 58. I counted them once, then I stopped, because the exact number was not as relevant as what it represented. Consistency, persistence, a complete reversal of what had been established just 48 hours earlier. I went back to the message. "Don't contact us again." It had not changed. No follow-up, no correction, no acknowledgement that the situation had shifted, which meant one of two things. Either the message no longer applied, or it had never been meant to apply in the way it was written. Both possibilities led to the same conclusion. Something had disrupted their expectation, not emotionally, structurally. I returned to the records, not because I expected new information, but because I needed to understand the timing. If something had triggered this level of urgency, it would have aligned with something external. A deadline, a requirement, a dependency. I reviewed the sequence again, dates, processing times, expected outcomes. And then I saw it, not a mistake, a gap, a step that required confirmation, not optional, not bypassable. And that step was connected to me, not directly in a way that could be forced, but indirectly in a way that could not be replaced. I looked at the timestamp. Then I looked at the current date. The gap had reached its limit. Whatever process they had completed, it had now reached the point where absence was no longer neutral. It was obstructive. I closed the file, and I understood. The calls were not about reconciliation, they were about completion. Something they had assumed would proceed without resistance had stopped, not visibly, but effectively. And the only way to move forward was through me. I sat there for a while, considering that, not the situation. The response. There is always a moment where you can choose to restore the previous balance. Answer the call. Allow the explanation. Participate in the resolution. Return everything to the way it was. And in doing so, accept that nothing has actually changed. Or you can allow the disruption to continue, not as punishment, as consequence. I did not feel anger. That part had already passed. What remained was clarity. And clarity does not require reaction. It requires consistency. So I remained consistent. I did not answer. I did not respond. I did not acknowledge the calls, not out of defiance, but because any form of engagement would have reintroduced negotiation. And this was no longer something I was willing to negotiate. The next morning, the calls slowed, not stopped. Slowed, which meant something else had shifted. Possibilities had been reconsidered. Alternatives had been explored. None of them had worked, because if they had, the calls would have stopped completely. Instead, they continued, just less frequently, more measured, as if someone had decided that persistence needed to be balanced with restraint. I watched the pattern adjust, the same way I had watched it form, because escalation, like everything else in this situation, followed structure. And structure, when it fails, reveals itself more clearly than when it works. By the end of the third day, there were fewer calls, still no explanation, still no acknowledgement of the original message. Just silence between attempts, waiting for me to respond. I did not, because by then the situation had already answered itself. By the third day, the silence had settled into something stable, not empty, defined. The calls had slowed, but they had not stopped. Messages appeared occasionally, short, controlled, still avoiding any direct reference to what had happened. Call when you can. We need to talk. It's important. The wording stayed careful. Not once did anyone mention the message. Not once did anyone explain the shift. It was as if those 2 days, the instruction to disappear, followed by the repeated attempts to reverse it, existed separately, unconnected. I read each message the same way, once, without replying. And then I put the phone down. There is a point where information stops adding anything new. After that, continuing to engage with it becomes a habit, not a necessity. I did not want habit to guide my response, so I let everything remain as it was, unanswered. Incomplete. That was when the weight of it began to settle, not suddenly, gradually. The kind of realization that does not arrive with emotion but with absence. There would be no explanation, not a complete one, not an honest one. Even if I answered, even if I listened, whatever I would be told would be shaped by the same structure that had already been in place. Minimize, redirect, conclude. I had seen that pattern enough times to recognize it without hearing it again. And more importantly, I understood what it would require from me. Participation, not just in the conversation, in the version of events they would present. Because once you accept the explanation, even silently, you become part of it, you validate it, and everything that happened before becomes something else. A misunderstanding, a confusion, something that can be resolved, but this was not confusion. It was not unclear. It had been organized, executed, and then closed. That last part mattered. The message had not left space for discussion. Don't contact us again. There is no ambiguity in that, no invitation to clarify, no condition attached. It was final, until it was. And that change, that reversal, was the part that stayed with me the most. Not because of what it meant for them, but because of what it required from me. To respond now would mean accepting that finality had been temporary, that it could be applied and removed depending on convenience. That I was expected to adjust to it without question. I had done that before, in smaller ways, accepted being informed late, accepted being excluded from decisions, accepted explanations that did not fully align. Each time the cost had been small enough to ignore. This time it was not. Because this time the exclusion had not just been social, it had been structural. My name had been used. My position had been assumed. My involvement had been removed. And then, when it became necessary again, I was expected to return, without acknowledgement, without correction, just continuation. I sat with that for a long time, not thinking about what to say, thinking about whether there was anything left to say. There is a difference. One is about response. The other is about recognition. And what I recognized was simple. Nothing I said would change what had already happened. Nothing I asked would produce an answer that was not already shaped. And nothing I did now would restore something that had been removed without my consent. So the question became something else. Not what to do, but what not to undo. Because silence at this point was not passive. It was the only thing that had interrupted the pattern. The only thing that had created consequence. The calls, the messages, the shift in tone. None of that would have happened if I had responded immediately, if I had called back, if I had accepted the situation as temporary. Silence had done something that words never had. It had forced a reaction, not emotional, practical. And that reaction revealed more than any explanation would have. I stood up, walked to the window, and looked outside. Nothing had changed. The street was the same. The buildings were the same. People moved the same way they always did. There was no visible indication that anything had shifted. And yet everything had, internally, structurally, permanently. I went back to my desk and looked at my phone again. Another message had come in. Please call. No name, no explanation, just that. I read it. And for a moment I considered it, not because I felt pressure, because I understood the weight behind it. But understanding something does not require responding to it. That is a distinction most people overlook. I placed the phone back down, and I made a decision, not out of anger, not out of defiance, but out of clarity. I would not respond. Not now, not later, not in a way that allowed this to continue as if it had not happened. There would be no confrontation, no demand for explanation, no attempt to correct the narrative, because the truth did not need to be argued. It already existed, in records, in timelines, in actions that could not be undone, and in the silence that followed them. That was enough, more than enough. The cost of that decision was clear: distance, possibly permanent, no closure, no acknowledgement, no resolution. But those things had already been removed. Quietly, before I had even been aware of it, all I was doing now was choosing not to restore them artificially. The phone remained on the table, still, unanswered. And for the first time since the message arrived, there was no uncertainty left, only consequence. The calls did not stop immediately. They changed. That was the first difference. Where they had once come in clusters, close together, persistent, almost mechanical, they began to space out. Hours between them, sometimes longer, as if whoever was calling had started to measure the silence instead of trying to break it. The messages followed the same pattern: fewer, shorter, more controlled, but still without explanation. That part never changed. No one addressed the message. No one acknowledged what had been said or what had been done. Everything existed in fragments, requests without context, urgency without detail. I read each one the same way I had before, once. Then I set the phone down. There was no need to revisit them. They were not adding anything new. Outside of that, my routine remained exactly the same. Work did not change. My schedule did not shift. Nothing in my day-to-day life reflected what was happening on the other side, which made the contrast clearer. Whatever pressure existed, it existed there, not here. That distinction mattered, because it meant the situation was not mutual. It was directional. Something had been set in motion without me. And now it could not continue without me. A few days later, a different kind of message arrived. Not from my mother, not from the same number, from someone I had not heard from in a long time. "We need to resolve this." I looked at the screen for a moment. Then I read it again. The wording was different, not a request, not an instruction, a statement, but still incomplete. Resolve what? Nothing had been defined. Nothing had been acknowledged. The message assumed a shared understanding that had never been established. I did not respond, because resolution requires clarity, and there was none being offered. Later that day, another message came. "This is getting complicated." That word stood out. Complicated, not difficult, not emotional, procedural. Something had encountered resistance. Something that was expected to move forward smoothly had stopped. And the absence causing that interruption was mine. I did not need more detail than that. Because I had already seen where the dependency existed, in the records, in the sequence, in the step that required confirmation. Without it, nothing could be finalized, and confirmation in this case could not be assumed. It had to be given, deliberately. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes for a moment, not to rest, to separate reaction from observation, because the situation at this point was clear. The original decision to exclude me had been made with the expectation that it would not create resistance, that I would either not notice or not act, and for a while that assumption had held, until it didn't. Now the same structure that had allowed them to move forward without me was preventing them from finishing what they started, not dramatically, quietly, but completely. The next message came that evening. This time it was direct. "We cannot proceed without you." I opened it, read it. Then I placed the phone down again. There it was, not an explanation, not an apology, a statement of dependency, clear, accurate, and late. I did not feel anything reading it. No satisfaction, no relief, just confirmation. Because by then the situation had already reached its conclusion, not in terms of outcome, in terms of understanding. Everything that needed to be known was already known. What remained was process, and process without acknowledgement does not create resolution. It creates repetition. The calls became less frequent after that, not because the need had disappeared, because the approach had failed. Repeated attempts had not produced a response, so they adjusted. Again, fewer interruptions, longer gaps, waiting, as if silence on their side might produce something different on mine. It did not. Time passed, days, then a week. The messages slowed to almost nothing, occasional, measured, still without explanation, still without reference to the beginning. The message that started everything remained unaddressed. "Don't contact us again." It stayed where it was, at the top of the conversation, unedited, uncorrected, unacknowledged, and beneath it everything else, calls, requests, statements, all of it existing without connection to the one thing that defined it. I did not delete it. I did not archive the conversation. I left it exactly as it was, because it did not need to be organized. It already was. A sequence, a reversal, a complete record of what had happened without anyone having to say it directly. And in that record, the consequences were already visible, not loud, not public, but fixed. There would be no clean resolution, no conversation that tied everything together, no moment where it was all explained and understood, because that would require something that had never been offered, accountability. Without that, everything remained exactly where it had settled, unresolved, but no longer unclear. The calls stopped without announcement, not all at once. They thinned out first, one every few days, then one after a week. Then nothing, no final message, no explanation, just absence. I did not mark the day it ended. There was no reason to. By then, the pattern had already completed itself. Everything that needed to happen had already happened. The message remained where it was. "Don't contact us again." Still at the top, unchanged. Below it, the missed calls, 58. Then the messages, short. Controlled, careful, all of it preserved in the order it occurred. I never went back to read them fully. There was nothing left to understand. I continued with my routine, the same structure, the same quiet, nothing outwardly different. But the absence had weight, not heavy, just present, like something that had been removed cleanly, without leaving damage, but also without leaving anything behind. There were moments when I thought about responding, not to restart anything, just to acknowledge that it had happened, but each time the same conclusion remained. There was nothing to add. Anything I said would come after everything that had already been done. And after that, words lose their position, so I left it, unanswered, unresolved, but not unclear, because clarity does not always arrive with explanation. Sometimes it arrives with sequence, with timing, with what happens and what follows. I did not need an apology. I did not expect one. What mattered had already revealed itself. In records, in decisions made without me, in a message that ended something without discussion, and in 58 calls that tried to reverse it without ever explaining why. That was enough, more than enough. So I kept the number. I kept the messages. I kept the silence, not as memory, not as evidence, just as they were, a complete record of something that was never said but fully understood.